Let's see if I can get my keyboard to move here. Sometimes it doesn't go to sleep. So today's session is basically a little bit about best practices sort of unlocked. We wanted to really talk about some of the things that we see continually when people implement DRM, as far as mistakes, things that could have been slightly better to, really improve the overall experience in their DRM application in general. Can I think gain a lot from some of the things that we're going to talk about today. A lot of what I wanted to do also is be able to enable clients that own the product to be able to, if someone's telling you something and you've read this or you've heard us talk about it before, you should be able to raise some questions about, what someone's telling you as far as how they're going about architecting or how they're going about the implementation. There's a few things that we find that are very common across the applications that aren't so good. Rob and I both have been a part of doing a number of health checks over the years and looking at different folks' systems. So we've seen a lot of different things. We're going to cover some of those today. Hopefully you guys will take away a lot of good information from this particular session. So what we're going to do is we're going to break it down into the versions, hierarchies, nodes, members, properties, queries, validations, all basic components of DRM. We're going to go through each one of them and kind of talk about what we normally are seeing again that isn't so good, and point out the things that are really best practice and that you should be following. I won't go over myself. I did come from Raza, the company that originally designed and developed this application. I learned from the guy that wrote the system. I work for US Analytics. We're an Oracle Platinum partner. We do all the things you expect from your Hyperion partners. We have managed services. We do all the products, planning, S-Base, you name it. You can see them all here. Our contact details are also available later in the deck. These are just a few of our clients that we've worked with over the years, a typical NASCAR slide, if you will. This is a profile on Rob Paramore. I want to thank him again for being able to make it today. He just hopped off of a plane visiting with a client down in Houston yesterday, so we're fortunate to be able to get him. Rob implemented DRM for a number of years, ran a practice for the Hackett Group, went back to Oracle, has been doing sales. He started out with the product as a user, as an owner, and brings a lot to bear when it comes to talking about how to and how not to implement DRM. So first we're going to start out with versions. Seems like the proper place to start if you know DRM. I'm just going to state it here. DRM was not designed to support this ever-ending open working version. I see time and time again where people have a single working version, they're making all their changes in it, they've been doing it for 5 years, and it's beginning to cause major problems and dysfunction for their application. Creates a lot of instability over time. It can make things architecturally difficult to scale, and it definitely limits the functionality that you can use in DRM when you don't do a proper versioning strategy. This is just some summary of what is a version. Everyone on the call hopefully knows what those things are. Our containers for hierarchies, right? Number of things we can do with these versions. We can do our what-ifing. We can definitely be creating our history, and those kind of things you can read there for yourself. This is just your basic life cycle management of a version in DRM. The statuses goes working, submitted, finalized. In our case, what we're talking about, what people are doing wrong, is when it comes down to the end or next month, whatever the next period may be, there's always this issue of, I want to keep an open version so I don't have to change maybe some batch or some reports that are looking at what we call production. So we leave that one open and we make a copy, and we put last month's date or last period's date on there, and we've got a backup of what our hierarchy looked like at that point in time. Yeah, great, wonderful, but there's some problems with that. Number one, it doesn't leave you with history attached to that month's activity. So when you do save that version, that old one, it's one that we would normally start with, which is a clean slate, and build it up from there, build all the transactions up from there. What you don't have is otherwise you just have this open version that is accumulating too much transaction history, and then you've got these older versions again that have no transaction history associated with them. So you couldn't go back and look at who made a change, at what point in time they made the change, and what change did they make. You couldn't do that without doing this versioning process correctly. Let's see if I got this right. So I put a little bit of that here on this slide so you guys can read a little bit about it. Again, this just kind of points out, always save your current working version, your current period, as your next period starting version. So when you save that, it'll save it with, it'll starting point. There's not any history against that, and that's where you work forward from. And then, of course, the version that you just finished working on for that month, you can change the status, like we were seeing in the flow chart, to go to submitted, finalized, or expired, however you want to do it. That will prevent people from messing around with the old data, and it will preserve the transaction history that occurred for that particular period of time. Most of the time it's a monthly basis, but it could be something different. Anyway, this will tell you a little bit more about it. Without doing this, you won't be Sarbanes compliant, and again, you're going to cause some problems for DRM when it comes to working with some of its functionality, like being able to check out things at a certain point in time. The rollback doesn't really work the way that most people might think it does. DRM, you guys have probably seen when you open up versions, you see a baseline underneath the version that you're trying to work with. The baseline shouldn't really be messed with. You can report on it. You could do a comparison against what you have there. But in general, you don't really need to mess with that one. It's there as a fresh copy, basically, of what that version and all the hierarchies look like when you first created it. So that is baseline. When we want to actually roll back something, we actually apply the transaction history up to the point in time that we want to see the data from the baseline. So we pull the baseline up, and any transaction history that's occurred that we want to see, boom, 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 we add that all up, and then here we are at that point in time. You can't really roll things back in the way that we manage hierarchies, because you inevitably will try to roll something back that doesn't exist. We're going to talk about hierarchies next. So DRM supports both primary and alternate hierarchies. You can have as many of any of those as you want. So if there's been anyone that told you otherwise, that's an incorrect statement. DRM supports multiple member node mappings across different hierarchies. When it comes to being able to relate information, you can relate information between different hierarchy structures. They may be that different ways of rolling things up. They also could be just different ways of aligning things, say products to different regional roll-ups, sales territories, different brandings, for example. They may have different ways of being rolled up, and you may want to do those as maps. We're going to talk a little bit more about those in detail. And Rob, anytime you want to jump in, please do so. Dimensions, domains, and hierarchies. These terms are often used very interchangeably. Don't get confused about it. Typically, when someone says dimension or domain, they're talking about a group of hierarchies that are the same thing. So maybe we've got multiple versions of our account hierarchy, general ledger structures, for example, multiple entity types. So we've got legal entities, we've got organizational roll-ups, etc. So those things are just different ways you can group things together. So don't get too hung up on terminology if people start throwing it at you. So it's just some basic jargon for you. And in hierarchy, to DRM, it really is kind of defined by the top node. Top node of a hierarchy can be apparent in an alternate view, but primarily it's what dictates what's going to fall underneath that. And the reason why is because children always follow their parents. So a hierarchy is typically defined by the top node. If it's an account structure, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be an entity. It's usually an entity, etc. Hopefully I'm not talking too fast. Types of hierarchies. These should be obvious, right? The way that Hyperion likes things, the way most of our OLAP-enabled technologies want things, is what we might refer to as a natural hierarchy, a jagged or a ragged one. Natural meaning that If it only has 3 levels in that particular section of the tree, it only has 3 levels. If you're dealing with a balanced tree, someone's going to come along and say, look, I need everything division to be at level 2. I need everything at region to be at level 3. I need everything to be at a specific level in the hierarchy, and it's going to force everything down to some level. So maybe your S-base level zeros are maybe your level 8. So even if you only have, say, 3 levels, you've got to balance the tree by putting 5 fake members between what you got and the bottom of the structure. And what that means to any OLAP tool or any kind of reporting that you would do if you're on a Hyperion side is a manager or whoever's having to click, 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 click 5 times through to get to the bottom line balance. And typically in Hyperion world, we don't like doing that. Some applications require a balanced hierarchy. OFSA, for example, one of Oracle's products requires a balanced tree. A number of them do, typically not Hyperion. And then this other thing, we call them abadabas. It's a strange old code. If you guys have really old mainframe ledgers that were derivatives of Trison, its predecessors or otherwise, you'll know what these kinds of codes are. They're a substitute for, in most cases, centers, and each of those positions represent maybe a division, region, and center kind of roll-up, maybe even company. And so those letters have to be sort of derived, and they're all common throughout the trees. Anyway, it's a real drag to keep them all in sync, but DRM can still do it. And remember this, hierarchies always belong together in a version. It should not be placed in separate versions just to maintain uniqueness, okay? Now, what I mean by this is I know a lot of you might be confused, but we've seen a number of implementations over the last several years where hierarchy account was put in version account. Hierarchy cost center was put in version cost center. If they had 10 different dimensions they were reporting on in HFM or S-base or planning, whatever it was, they were all in a separate version by themselves. That is not how you want to maintain DRM. That is not a scalable application. It's very difficult to try to maintain something like that, and hierarchies belong together. They share cycles, they share each other, they need to be in the same place. And if you're raising your hand going, oh, what about this problem with the e-business suite adapter, da-da-da-da-da, we have a way around that. If you get, if you have that issue and you're calling attention to that, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll explain to you how to get around the problem that was created by that adapter.
Yeah, and another thing along those lines, Greg, is that within DRM you're going to use one hierarchy to another, especially if you think on the Hyperion planning side, you've got some attribute structures that you need to make reference to from cost center, from account. If those are in their own separate versions, you can't do that within DRM easily. So by having them all in the same version, you're able to reach out and make those as part of your attributes or in DRM parlance properties within those structures and make reference to them easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And we got some slides a little later on that'll call attention to some of those very things too. And that's the thing where these guys do need to be together in order to be working the way they should. And an alternate hierarchy, it's different ways of maybe describing what these things really are, but typically an alternate is some kind of a subset of a primary dimension. It could be a different way of rolling up some things, so it's possible that maybe you've had to cherry pick a few members out of the primary structure, create some unique roll-ups for some specific planning need, managed reporting need, whatever it might be. There's any number of reasons why we have alternate roll-ups. In general, it's because we don't do managed reporting the way that we report statutory, right? And everybody knows we got a lot of regulatory, we've got IFRS, we've got GAAP, in most clients that I've been at, we've got at least 5 different account roll-ups. So a lot of different reasons why you're going to have alternates and valid reasons as well. A member node, as Rob was alluding to, can be a member of multiple hierarchies. If it is, and you're in different versions, then you wouldn't be able to reference one another, and maintenance of those things would then become not very much fun. A node will always have the same descendants in any alternate hierarchy, so it doesn't really matter anytime you take a member node, put it in any kind of structure, it'll always have its children follow, always. And orphans are possible. You may need to clean those up every once in a while. I'll talk to you in a second just about what an orphan really is, but this is just going to give you an idea of what an alternate hierarchy might look like.
Yeah, and going back to what you were saying about the rules around the alternate hierarchies, Greg, the strict rules is we being DRM follows the interpretation more of the audit team. If you're going to call a roll-up the cost of goods sold, it needs to have the same membership and its descendants everywhere. But I can't tell you the number of clients I've walked into that each team or application that they had a different meaning of cost of goods sold. And that's really not something, when you think about it from an audit regulatory perspective, that shouldn't happen. Things like that are what got the MCIs of the world and the Enrons of the world in trouble. So we want to make sure that you're allowing it to do the enforcement for you. If you are going to do it differently, call it something different because it doesn't represent cost of goods sold. And like Greg's showing here, it needs to represent what it is accurately in there. And if it's an alternate version of that, just call it that. We don't have a problem maintaining that, but you just have to make it unique all the way up the tree to the top level in order to do it from the point that you're breaking off from what's not unique. So back to you, Greg.
Oh, that's really great, and it leads it right into this diagram. See if I can get the thing to finish animating. So in this diagram, we have a picture of 3 different hierarchies: hierarchy 1, 2, and 3. We call them A, X, and Z. There's top nodes of these hierarchies, and you can see real easily which ones you've got as tops, and you can also see what the membership is below those hierarchies, and you can see that they can share members across them, and what happens to them when they do share them. When you look at H2, because of his connections with D, he gets E coming along with him, and then he's also connected over to H3, X and Z are, so he also sees W. And and since 3's over there kind of down below by himself, really all he sees is that piece that he's involved with. So alternates, top nodes, members, things can be shared across different ways of being able to construct your hierarchies. Always good to do really strong requirements analysis when it comes to developing your structures in DRM. Just remember this: the way we manage DRM hierarchies is different than the way that we're managing them in the systems that we're sending them to. DRM can easily put data in a format that the downstream systems that we integrate with may require. And believe me, there's a big difference between what HFM wants to see, S-based planning, and your general ledger are going to need. The different attributes, the different structures, the naming conventions, all those things are going to be unique. So DRM can handle all that. But what we want to do is we want to put things into DRM in a way that makes it easy for our business consumers to maintain and easy for you all to be able to scale. And so getting it in the system right, as far as this hierarchy, design is concerned, is a huge part of being successful at the end of the day. When we talk about these things, it's important because we do a lot of mappings in DRM. You guys know this, right? So mappings can be done by using structure alone. So with parent-child relationships, it may be that it's a general ledger chart of accounts type of thing, and maybe you've got 5 or 6 different GLs that make up, account 101. So you could have children of account 101, say GL1, GL2 through GL10, and whatever their numbers are mapped to the 101. Those are simple structural mappings, if you will. We can also map between nodes and across hierarchies, as Rob and I were saying. We have some attributes in DRM, some property types, data types that we use that will help us make a pointer, a one-way or a two-way. We can do one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many. We can definitely create linkage between different hierarchies in DRM. And from those linkages, we can derive information from the parents of those connected. We can pull back data on their node levels or on other things that are constructed in those other hierarchies. So by connecting the dots between them, we also get other bits of information and maybe other connections as well. Put this chart in. I can't remember if multi-node is still one of the available data types. It seems like it might not be. But this is just kind of a quick overview of the types of data, the data types, I'm sorry, that you'll see. And look for these in your documentation, associated node, nodes, and group. Just give you a real brief, description of what they are and what happens with the targets. It's all documented in the DRM, documentation from Oracle. So it's not hidden. It's always been there. It's just that a lot of people don't use it and don't think about it as much as they should. There's probably a few myths. Originally, you couldn't load these associated node properties from an external source or initially load them up. You had to do it all manually, and that's no longer true. You can import a comma delimited list of values into one of these fields. There's some issues with being able to validate it, but if you're in the construction mode phase, you shouldn't have any real problems with that.
Hey, and Greg, back on that last screen, I don't believe the multi-node exists any longer. But the other one thing I'd add on all the associated nodes pieces, depending on what release everyone on the line's on. If you're on an older release before 11.122. Associated node was a little bit to get wrapped around. When you clicked on associated node, it gave you the entire list of structures available, not the one you intended to always show. But now, combination of how you have your hierarchy groups arranged, and you have and within the property itself, you have the ability to laser focus on exactly what hierarchy you want users to interact with. Which is powerful both in DRM and in the workflow component, DRG, from a control perspective. And then the other thing along with those, associated node, since it is a hierarchy, some other team could be managing the membership in that hierarchy that it's referencing. So, think about that for those that have more of a centralized model with DRM. You're able to put that out into the business that owns that list, allow them to update it from a reference data perspective. Back to you, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, it's a very good point. Definitely a bit of enrichment has taken place with this functionality, and it's really nice to see when you put this together. It comes up in a nice little window and all. It's certainly a lot more user-friendly in the way that it looks and acts nowadays than when it was originally introduced. We'll go on and talk about, nodes and members of these hierarchies a bit more, and just some more best practices that are around them. Just so you know, DRM member nodes are by definition global, and what that means is that once a member has been added to DRM, you can insert that into as many hierarchy structures as you want within that version. Okay, and in DRM, we saw how it supports multiple parents, imports and blends versus scripts and automations. We'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of seconds. And then the use of domains, prefixes, and hierarchy groups to help you really manage the architecture of your DRM system. Imports originally were something that were built for a bulk capability. So if we're initially loading up the application or we're running thousands of records through, this is why we built imports initially, and to be able to do some very quick comparison work between different kinds of structures. So it's a real nice feature that we combine with blenders to be able to help do analysis on hierarchies, looking for differences between them, being able to blend them together into a single view where maybe we had 3 or 4 different hierarchies that really should have been the same thing. This is the kind of process that would use to help us bring those all into harmony with one another. A few limitations to being able to do these. you have to load into a new empty version, and then you have to blend into your final destination. So there's a few steps that you have to go through when you're doing imports. But it is, very quick. It's very fast to load, and it pretty much looks like a spreadsheet, right? You got parent, child, and any attributes that you need coming after that. There can be some different sections in the import, so you can create the version name and the hierarchy name, the top member that it goes into, and you can load up the structure or the data. So I definitely encourage you to go out and look at the documentation on imports because it's got a lot of cool features to it. Recently, they added some additional features so you could pull data from a table as well as from a flat file. So that may mean that there's a lot less manipulation of the information to create, say, a flat file for some of you. Might be easier to be able to pull it in from a table directly than to have to create a special formatted file for a number of you. The Blender, again, as I said, is a paired piece of functionality with the import. It allows any two hierarchy fragments to get merged, and it has so many different options that you can do in the way that you can process. You can do some really, if you're not paying attention, you can really mess some stuff up. So pay particular attention to all the checkboxes on the Blender, and I know there's a lot of different things there. What I normally would encourage people to do when they use Blenders is to use them in steps. So what I mean by that is process structural changes first, and then property attribute changes last. So I would process some, let's say, for example, I may do all my add inserts and do my moves, and if someone did do a remove or an inactivate, I may want to do that one last. And then I would go in and maybe, once all of that's settled, then I might move all my property attributes. I do not recommend running a Blender all out, meaning it does all of that at once, unless it's a very small dimension or hierarchy that you're working with. If anything breaks anywhere along the line, it becomes a little more difficult to figure out what it was or what's causing the problem. If you do it the way I'm telling you to do it right here, you'll be able to isolate where that problem exists, and you won't be pulling all your hair out quite as quickly. Anything that you want to add to that, Rob?
The only challenge we have with the Blender is that you don't get margaritas at the end. That's the one thing that's kind of a downfall with it. But sometimes you need those, depending on if they go awry or not. And along the lines of what Greg was saying, I mean, when you're testing it, always blend to a third version, to a new version. Don't blend into an existing version until you have that perfected. I'll give you a good customer story. I was setting in a site, financial services customer in London, and we were in production, and we were there for a phase 2, and they came in and said, DRM's broke. Things are wrong. Well, this morning it failed, and not everything blended over. Well, upon further investigation, the Blender, because we didn't have it set up to remove deletes or process deletes, we only marked for delete, actually saved them and identified a problem on the feed of the import file coming in. That feed or export out of their SAP general ledger got corrupted and only spit out half of the information. So had we had the Blender set up to process removes, which was an earlier discussion with them about not doing that, it would have wiped out everything, all the history they had in DRM, because it would have just gone on and taken care of it. But instead, it made that available, showed that to them, and actually strengthened the position of how DRM is going to do in the tools within it are going to do exactly what you've got set up and recommend it to them on a consistent basis.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we do support shared nodes and duplicates, based on that. By definition, you all probably know that DRM won't allow duplicate. If you try to put a duplicate in, it's going to reject it and tell you it already exists. You can insert it, but you can't add it. That just means, you can put it in multiple places. If you put a member node in a single hierarchy, if you try to put it in there with different parents in multiple places, so if it's in the top part of your structure somewhere and it's down somewhere lower in some regional roll-up or something like that, DRM, when you do the import process, if you set it up, will mark that as a shared member, and it'll number them, shared 1, shared 2, shared 3, shared 4, however you want to nomenclate that. There's some things inside the import process that'll help you deal with, what happens whenever you do have, shared members that are valid duplicates. If there are a number of different ways of dealing with that. I highly recommend looking at the documentation and reading that and playing around with the way that shared members work. I will say that there are differences between HFM, S-based, and planning and the way that shared members are worked and are treated. So it's worth, when you're putting in DRM and you're finding a lot of shared members and some hierarchies coming from the business in one place or another, it's worth pushing back, asking some questions as to why those things exist. I've seen some bad hierarchy design where someone thought that, if I'm doing, let's say, a customer by BU, and then I wanted to see that, vendor by customer kind of upside down kind of view, I needed to, show that in DRM, or actually build that in DRM, and not realizing that just being an attribute would allow me to, pivot the view, by, any of the key pieces of data that I had. And what happened was, when they were loading in the data, they turned basically everything upside down and gave it a different parent, and then everything below became shared members. And I thought that was a really strange thing, and it created a lot of maintenance and a lot of problems, and it became very confusing for people to understand what they were doing and what they were looking at. I put them immediately into an alternate hierarchy and got them out of the bottom of that structure. At least then you could come in through the BU side or through the customer side and do maintenance at the lower level address. Before, you had to do it in kind of one place and know where the references were. So spend a little bit of time working out, what you're doing with shared nodes and how you're going to handle duplicates if you have them. Okay, here. Oh, anything that you wanted to add there before we moved on, Rob? This one's going to go.
No.
Okay. Okay, good. All right, so DRM properties. I'm not going to go through all of these slides. We can thank our product manager, Matt Lonchar, for these slides. Some things that needed to be documented for a long time. He put together in a slide deck for all the partners and did some training probably about 4 years ago, and 11.122, I think, was released. They introduced some new functions in the DRM property world, some new capabilities like Jython, and some additional capabilities to be able to see or evaluate how much time a property was taking to calculate, for example. So in doing that, he also went through and talked about how to properly design a DRM formula and some of the things that go along with that. And so they are a very powerful tool. They can get you into trouble if you don't do them right. And so that's what we want to talk a little bit about. You can cover these slides, like I said, you'll get them. And you can read them. If you have any questions about them, and you can't figure it out, obviously just reach out to us, and we'll be definitely glad to get online, show you how it works in DRM, or talk to you a little bit more about it. I did mention that DRM now does support the Jython scripting. Does augment a lot of functionality. I've seen it used especially to enhance error messages that come up when validations occur. You can make things a little bit more specific by using some Jython scripting attached to that. I will tell you that you can't point a Jython script at a DRM property formula, or you shouldn't. It kind of defeats the purpose. It was originally done so that you could do some things that might be kind of heavy lifting outside of DRM so you didn't cause performance issues. And if you try to point a Jython script at a DRM calculated property, you're probably not going to get anything anyways. If it does work, it's probably going to be haphazard at best in what it returns. I don't think there's any issue in pointing at a defined field where the data was directly entered in DRM, but anything that's a formula, you don't want to do that. You'd have to recreate that formula, or that logic, if you will, within the Jython script itself to be able to make it autonomous and not negatively impact your DRM application. So just a little bit of blah, blah, blah on the Jython piece. A couple things I've seen recently, just so you guys know. You cannot use namespace any way that you want. They introduced this concept back in 11.121 when we got the web version of DRM. It's some dot notation that goes in front of a property name. You guys will see that with the delivered templates from Oracle, where you'll see HP, FM. You'll see those dots in front of the properties that they delivered, and so just be real careful in that when you create a namespace, if you want to create one that's unique for whatever reason, just make sure that you put custom dot in the beginning of any of those name fields. Okay, so if you want to have custom dot my system dot member name, that's great, but don't create my system name blah 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 dot whatever without putting custom in there. It could inevitably create problems. Oracle support will not be able to help you in some future migrations or even current ones if you don't do this correctly. So please make sure, if you got any consultants or any technical people that are out there creating custom properties for you now, just make sure. It'll always default when you do it in the DRM interface. It'll come up custom dot, and you can put whatever name you want there. But everyone's figured out a way that they can put their own dot notation in, and the bottom line is it's not best practice, and if it doesn't say custom in there, Oracle might not respect you. And that means it might not bring it over, might delete it, not treat it properly, whatever the case may be. Okay, end of that soapbox. Properties can be global, local, they can be at a node level, they can be at a hierarchy level, they can be at a version level, and you can inherit from all of those. So you can set properties at a version level that control everything down to the member node. Same thing from a hierarchy, down below as well, so on and so forth. Inheritance is a very powerful part of DRM. Setting defaults is a very powerful part of DRM. Most things that inherit, my team, my guys that we normally coach, DRM consultants and the like, to derive things using formulas and not use the native inheritance in DRM. You can do that, but it can present problems with regards to the fact that there are values that are being stored places, and if things change, you're going to have to go back and maybe move those, update those, etc. You still have to maintain them. And it's easy enough for someone to step on something that should be inheriting from a higher level and not know that something in between is messing that up. Normally when we write properties that derive that, we don't have that kind of a problem, and we can code around it. So, so be careful about that. Local properties, by definition, allow you to hold different values for members, within a hierarchy. So if you've got different hierarchies that share nodes between them for whatever reason, say, are in different structures, alternate views, etc., you can set up a local property and say, the name, field, or description in this hierarchy can be different than the other one. Not that from a governance or best practice you should do that kind of thing, but you can. And so in some cases, it may be accumulating differently or ignored in some structure in an S-based cube. There can be reasons why certain, values and properties should be local and unique to where they're being used. But it's better the more things that are global, the more things that are shared, the more common things are, the less maintenance that you have to do long run, and the more things seem to stay even. So I won't belabor all of these any more than I have to. There are performance guidelines that are in here. These are some steps that you would want to go through when looking at performance of your formulas in DRM. If you have an application that's out there and you're having some issues with performance and you haven't already upgraded to 11.124, do that, please, and upgrade to the most recent patch level on 11.124. You will see at least a 35 to 40% increase in performance over where you were the day before you do that. 11.123, anything behind it, I guarantee 11.124 will be obviously faster. Do some of the things you want to do in this presentation. Take a look at some of these formulas, evaluate some of the things we're talking about, and you can probably get rid of a lot of issues performance-wise that you may be having today. Understanding the formula functions that are out there and which ones that are very expensive to run, I think that's kind of an important thing. There's a slide in here that'll note where things and why you want to pay attention to them, and we'll kind of go into a little bit more detail about what you see here on this slide, if you will. The the features using formulas. So DRM, there's a lot of things in here that cause formulas to execute. So if you're just browsing the database, everything's being calculated. If you're searching, if you're editing, if you're running an export, an import, all of these things cause formulas to calculate. So you can imagine you got a lot of things calculating over and over again, calculating too many times, got a lot of this stuff going on in parallel. These are going to be things that cause you scaling issues, performance issues. So good to understand, what these things are that cause formulas to be calculated. Optimizing these formulas, a lot of different ways to write them. There are some new functions that are available that would replace some of the older things that were done in DRM prior to 11.122 probably. I would definitely, again, recommend that you go out to your documentation from Oracle and take a look at those things. There's some real powerful utilities that can replace some of the things that you may be doing and make them a lot more efficient and a lot easier to manage as well. The way formulas are written definitely have a significant impact on performance. One thing that I do mention here is if you're using properties with if logic, which most of them seem to have some kind of conditional stuff in them, if you condition to let's say an and, what will happen is DRM evaluates these conditions as you go down through the formula. So if it goes through the formula and the first condition is not met, DRM stops calculating the formula. So for example, if you have a formula that's only going to be used in, I don't know, let's say an account structure, and you're in a product structure, you don't want that to be calculated over there because it's going to cause problems. The structure is different, the values are different, causes wackiness and things to go wrong. You can put an if statement to say, hey, if I'm in this hierarchy group or if I'm in this hierarchy, then do X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, it'll just end, okay, and it'll stop it from executing. So DRM will execute properties and formulas all across the board unless you tell them not to or give them condition not to process. And there's a number of different ways of doing that, but putting this kind of if logic in means that you can stop a formula from going on and on and on and on if it doesn't meet the first condition or one of the first two conditions. So be careful about the way you write ifs and ors and the way that you should nest your formulas. And the things go into that in more detail. I'm not going to belabor all of that on this particular call because we don't have enough time to go into all of it. But you should be able to read through this and get a warm and fuzzier about some of the things that you can and should and shouldn't be doing. There are node type implications to things that we're discussing. Node types are evaluated as well when browsing hierarchies, displaying node level properties, etc. Guidance is being given to now not overload the node type property. It should never be entered by a business user. It should always be calculated. But now what we can do is we can assign node types to different attributes at different levels in the hierarchies, to limbs and leaves that are different. And so we can have them that way rather than having to have a whole lot of convoluted logic to say if it's in, if it's else, and this. So you can have specific node types for accounts, for products, for entities, and then they can have just the logic that pertain to them. So each hierarchy can point to the node type that you want to use for it. And it's a really nice way of saying that I can have account node type, product node type, this node type, that node type, and I can use them all individually with the different domains that they're in and not overload the node type property and cause calculation problems. Anything you want to add to that, Rob?
Sorry, I was just getting off mute. Along the lines with the node types, I mean, it really does make it a lot easier for your end users to come in and see things. And you have the ability to create your own glyphs that you're using in there with the node types, so that when you come in, you can immediately know what's a leaf member, what's a parent, what's your top level member. I was just at a customer that had, on average, 3 node types per hierarchy, and it really looked very nice and streamlined, seeing their hierarchy structures. So something to think about there.
Yeah, I mean, visually things, people seem to react better with things that are visual. And, when the hierarchies all look alike, it could, can get confusing. You may be making changes in the wrong place. But I think it also is cool that, like Rob said, you can assign, and have these different views. And, if you know the application well enough, you'll know what's associated with them and what you need to be doing at those levels and structures. And you'll be able to see that more readily just by looking at it than, having to, okay, what level is that? Is that, this, or is it that? And with the glyphs, you can show that very easily. This slide just is a list of expensive formula functions. Use them, when you need to, but use them smartly. If you go into your DRM formula list and you see a property out there that says custom Johnny property, and it says list descendants, open paren, close paren, delete it. Okay? You don't want to do that. These are very expensive properties. And what you did was you just created a property that already exists in DRM. Anything that says core can be used by anyone anywhere. So use the core attributes. Don't redefine core attributes in a DRM property by simply saying list descendants open and close without any restrictions whatsoever, because that's going to take at the bottom of that hierarchy. Let's say you got 1 million records in there and there's all these descendants all the way up the tree, and it's going to calculate that for every one of them, and you are going to slow your system down like you won't believe. These ancestor lists, children, it all depends on exactly where you are in the structure, but you can just imagine all the calculating that's going on to be able to fill in these kind of functions. So use them where you need to, make sure they're heavily qualified and aren't running amok with just filling out, everything that's out there. There's a definite price to pay. Expression caching, what's this all about? Derived properties in our validations can evaluate the same expression multiple times for the same node. There's an example of it in here. What you want to try to do if you end up in these kind of situations where you need to examine something multiple times is you need to break out the formula or the property into, the formula into separate properties. That's what I want to say. So instead of having all of that in a nested if condition in the same attribute property, break it down into separate ones. That way what happens is DRM is going to calculate each of these formulas at a node level. You can take another property and look at each one of those nodes, and this has been calculated because it's only already been calculated, and evaluate based on that. If you take all of those and put them all in one particular property and nest them, then DRM will end up calculating them every time, boom, 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 over and over and over again. And this can also cause great degradation in your process and performance. So, if it's a shared kind of a process or something that's going to get called several times within these formulas, do it once. DRM will calculate it for that node, and then you can just refer to it in a property that evaluates what you're trying to evaluate. There's an example, I think, in here as well, so that it makes a little bit more sense. But you'll create a new derived property that only contain the expression, that you're looking at, that you're calling multiple times. And then, like I said, it breaks it down into smaller pieces. If you don't want the users to see it, if it's part of a, of a back-end object that you're creating that you need several different pieces to really operate properly, there's a place in there, and when you're creating your DRM properties, and it's a checkbox and it says hide. And you can hide those properties and nobody will ever see them except an administrator. And so the only thing that gets exposed is that, it calculates when it's supposed to and no other time. Works great. And it's the way Kevin McKenzie, this guy that wrote DRM, he explained this to me when I first started working with it about 12, 13 years ago. And he said you can look at it kind of like separate objects that you can reuse. So break your attributes down into smaller components. You'll be able to test them quicker. You'll be able to see if there's a problem with them quicker. You'll be able to fix them quicker. And you can use them multiple times by different kinds of things in different ways without having to rewrite that code over and over and over again.
Yeah, and along those lines, it gives you the ability, it makes it easier to understand. So if for some reason the administrator moves on, wins the lottery, retires, whatever the case is, you're not going in and trying to figure out a formula that takes, system administrator level access to understand, or somebody that's been implementing the software for a while. So you want to make it as simple as possible to transition from one group to another. And back to what Greg was talking about earlier with the Java or the Python scripting, you can now comment in those fields with in the expressions, which is a very nice feature function that's available now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Rob. So this slide right here, it gives an example of it. You guys can look at it a little later on, but take a look at it and you'll see what I'm talking about, how this is actually calculating 4 times. You could have broken that down into, one string that was evaluated, and then you just call that one time, and it's a lot quicker. Makes the whole formula a lot smaller too, a lot easier to read and understand. A lot fewer of those parentheses that you got to worry about closing out at the end of that formula. This will give you a little bit, again, I think this is the same one, different example. I wanted to bring up, we're kind of running out of time, so I wanted to kind of run these a little bit quicker. And I can keep going if you guys want to stay on. We're happy to do that. Take a look. A lot of you may not know it, but there is a diagnostics utility that's provided out there on the application server when you install DRM. But it's a property profiler, and so you can take up a property, and with this command line interface, or even through a batch process, you can run it and you can actually see how long it's taking to do what it's doing, and do some of these kind of checks and see what the performance looks like. And you can test me too. Try some of these hash child with open close paren and a big hierarchy structure, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Anyway, so I just wanted to bring that up since there. Validation queries, I didn't really have a whole lot to say about this. You guys probably understand that they can be run in batch, real time, or on demand. When you run an export now, you can run a specific validation if you want to. If it fails, it won't put the data out to Essbase. So for example, if you want to make sure member alias combinations are unique, run that as a validation when you run your export to Essbase or wherever. And make sure that data is right before it gets sent out and corrupts your cube. So DRM Classic cannot test for the existence of a value until the record is committed or saved. There's always been an issue with DRM. It's just the way it is. If you need to be able to validate that something exists before it does get saved, use the DRG, because you can do that kind of thing with the DRG now. You can also validate using external databases and third-party API calls with the DRG. So if you need to really make the interface, that a little more user-friendly than the classic interface will allow, go to the DRG, and that'll take care of your problem. Validations and queries, again, something that I've seen folks not doing much of, which is using list lookups in DRM. You can avoid a lot of unnecessary validations by putting things in list and list lookups as DRM property types. If the user could only select from the list that's there, then why do you need to validate it, right? So you don't need those validations if you can actually define lists that your users can pick from. Again, that's the trying to get away from the 10 keying and all that kind of stuff, making mistakes with your fingers and all that. Again, these are lists and lookups and cause you not to have to validate. So don't forget they're there. They're very powerful, lots of different ways to use them as well, and combinations of being able to derive things. And when I do validations in DRM, and what I coach folks on is to create properties instead of queries, especially if it's something that gets done a lot. So if you want to have an isValidName property, most everybody has one that's called a valid name. Validations for that, or the length of it, or a character, maybe there's something in there that they want to validate for. At any rate, you could build DRM formulas, property formulas, and you can make them evaluate the logic that you're looking to evaluate. And I create them and call them isValid. So if you see it in most of our team's builds, you'll see an isValid this or an isValid that. And those are properties that are being used by a validation query. And so they're calculated in DRM. You can see if they're true or false because it's already been done. You can run queries on that. So if it's not the way it's supposed to be, you can send that out and get it fixed. If you have DRG deployed, you can take the list and copy that into the DRG, and it'll automatically send it to everybody that's supposed to go fix their problems. So there's ways of relegating that to everyone else. And what it lets you do is it lets you build queries that only evaluate kind of on a Boolean basis. Is this true, yes or no, or true or false? It makes your queries run a lot faster, and it doesn't cause them to have to calculate again. Remember I told you again, remember those things that calculate and when they calculate? This way all the member nodes are calculated for those validations, and it's not calculating it on the fly. DRM will let you store these very complex queries now with your exports and your validations. With exports, I can understand the business users may want to be able to do that. They probably can't create a is valid formula in DRM, so they may mess around, do that with a query, and it's good that they have some extra functionality to do that. But if it's something that's going to be done all the time and it's something that's happening or it needs to be fixed, you know, if you're the IT group or you're the business guys, give it to the IT guys, make them create a custom property for that, and then all you have to do is query on it. Is it true, yes or no? If it's not valid, give me the list. If it is valid, give me the list, whatever you want to do. Okay. Also, be consistent in your naming. Standards for naming should be established before you develop any DRM component. The version, the hierarchy, the member nodes, how they're prefixed, the property names, the names of your exports, validations, queries, all that stuff needs to be prefixed and needs to be named consistently. Otherwise, you'll end up with a mess that you cannot support. And again, like Rob was saying, you know, if somebody leaves the company or moves on in the company and you're left with supporting this thing, this will help a whole lot because you'll be able to see what belongs to what, and that goes a long ways. Hopefully, we got some questions. We kind of are right at the top of the hour. I apologize for that. A little bit to carry on with today, and certainly we're happy to have a follow-up to this session for anyone that would like to have one. If you want to go through and talk a little bit more about what you've seen in your own application, you know, guys like Rob and I are happy to get on a conference call, WebEx, take a look at what you've got, give you some advice on ways to maybe move forward. And yeah, Rob, you got anything else that you want to bring up? Yasmin, are you getting any questions also, if we can pass those by?
Nothing here, Greg.
Okay, bud. Hopefully everybody got some good information out of this one today. We're not getting too many questions, which is, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Either I put everybody to sleep, Rob, or we answered everybody's best practices questions, which would be great. Give it a couple more seconds. I don't see any other ones coming in. Certainly appreciate everyone jumping on today. I know we got into a little bit more of the detail here than we do in a lot of these kinds of webcasts, but we wanted everyone to kind of see some of these things. It's typically these things aren't trained on when you go to a training class, an admin class, or whatever. Usually doesn't cover these kind of things. So we're talking about best practices and what to do. Some of the things and what you get on those training classes and whatnot, you know, the folks may or may not have had a lot of field experience, and you know, they may have a misinterpretation of how DRM actually works, and they have been known to give advice on implementation that could have been better. So be careful what you take away. Always remember to, if you're in doubt, talk to your Oracle SEs or call your partners like US Analytics that have strong consultants, and you know, we'd be happy to help you understand what you might be getting off the road on. If you've got a consultant in there that doesn't understand some of the concepts that we've been talking about today, that might be a red flag, and it'd be a good time to call your Oracle pre-sales team, sales rep, or one of your partners to you know, maybe help evaluate where you're at. Anyway, I don't really have anything else to add. Certainly do appreciate everyone's time. Give you back the rest of your day. Please reach out to us again if you have any questions. We will be following up. You'll get a copy of the deck, and you'll get a copy of the webcast. And this is the end of our 4-part series on Mythbusters, and we certainly appreciate all of you for attending, and have a great week. And if we don't talk to you before then, have an enjoyable holiday.